Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on federal policy and advocacy. This session is meant to help educators in Virginia better understand federal education policy and how they can effectively engage. My name is Lexi Barrett. I'm an Associate Vice President at Jobs for the Future, where I lead our policy work. And I'm very excited today to welcome two longtime friends and colleagues as our guests, Maria Warden and Lillian Pace. I'd love to get started first by asking each of you to share a little bit about your background, both kind of in the policy world and kind of outside of it. So Maria, do you want to start first?
Sure. Hi there. So my name is Maria Warden, and I live in Falls Church, Virginia, with my husband, a 4-year-old, and 2 cats, soon to be in Fairfax County schools next year. So very excited to be speaking to a Virginia audience for this podcast. I have been in education policy for almost 2 decades now. I got my start actually as a social worker who came to Washington thinking that she could really make a difference as an employee in the federal government. And while my 7 years at the U.S. Department of Education were valuable and I wouldn't trade them for anything, I am not sure that I can say that I made a huge difference there. I learned that it's the job of the federal government to implement the law, not to change it. Despite the rhetoric that you might even see coming out of the executive branch, there's a lot that can be done, but there's also a lot that can't be done. And so after 7 years at the U.S. Department of Education working on a variety of programs, I spent 3 years working for the chairman of the United States Senate Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee as we were trying to rewrite No Child Left Behind. And that's actually where I met the two of you. So that gave me some insight into how policy actually gets made, but then using my experience from the Department of Education, understanding how it gets implemented, that's where I felt like I was really able to start to make a difference. And now for the last 8 years, I've been an advocate, working in a nonprofit space, and currently as the founder and principal consultant of my own consulting firm, Education Policy Strategies.
Thanks, Maria. Lillian, why don't you go?
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. And much like Maria, I'm also a proud Virginia resident. So it's always fun when you get to do something for your home state. My name is Lillian Pace, and I live in Alexandria City. So we are proud members of the Alexandria City Public Schools. I've got 2 kiddos in the young kindergarten to 2 age range, suffering very poorly through virtual schooling. So I can appreciate all the challenges on the ground that educators and parents are sharing in this moment, and certainly know there's no better time to start to think about how to advocate for a better system moving forward. My background, similar to Maria, I've had about 2 decades working in education policy. The first decade was really spent on Capitol Hill, working for various members of Congress as well as the U.S. House Education and Labor Committee. During, much like Maria, during the time where we were working on reauthorization of the nation's federal K-12 law, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So had a tremendous amount of experience that I'm so grateful for in sort of learning how to write laws and how to navigate so many different perspectives that are brought to you from across the country, but really felt like I was missing that real world sense of what happens once laws are enacted and how they really impact people on the ground. So I decided to dedicate the next decade of my career to working outside of the Beltway and outside of the Washington, D.C. space. So I have been working for a nonprofit organization called KnowledgeWorks, focusing on helping advance policies and transformation at the local level to personalized and competency-based education systems. So I get to work with policymakers at the federal and the state levels sometimes even the local level. And I get to work, in arm in arm with educators across the nation to help advocate. So it's been a thrill to get to, from a personal experience to, to get to work on the inside the Beltway DC, experience, and then get to work outside with the people that are impacted by the loss firsthand. So yeah, that's me.
And I have a similar experience, to both of you. So I also started my career on the political side of government. I spent 6 years on the Hill. I was at the Department of Education for a year where I worked on waivers of No Child Left Behind. And I spent a couple of years in the Obama White House working on K-12 policy and early education policy, before similarly leaving to go to the external world. And part of what I've really loved about my time at JFF is that we're very focused on bringing the practitioner voice into policy, which in my time as a policymaker was definitely something that I saw as a gap, that there were a lot of conversations that kind of swirled around inside the Beltway, but didn't necessarily have any real connection point to what was happening in the real world or the impacts of those policies. So it's been really great to spend the past almost 5 years at JFF doing policy work from the side. So before we dive into kind of the nuts and bolts of engaging in policy, which is what we want to spend the bulk of this time talking about together, given that it's a bit of a crazy time in the world and in education, I thought it'd be great to give a little bit of an update about what is the federal government, so what is Congress and what is the Department of Education thinking about and doing right now as we enter fall and school year of 2020 when it comes to education policy. Lillian, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think most everyone is thinking, wondering what's going to happen with the election. So anytime we get to this stage of an election year, as you can imagine, it makes it really hard to get any kind of education policy across the finish line. It's a lot of members want to kind of wait and see what happens. And, for the most part, the goal really just becomes making sure that they finish, the appropriations bills for the year so that the government remains funded throughout the transition process. Obviously, this year is a little different in that we are experiencing a national pandemic, and that has hit our school system exceptionally hard. Educators are suffering. They need resources to make ends meet, to try to reach their children in virtual or hybrid models. And for those that are in person, even more so, to keep the buildings safe. And so educators are, I think, making a really compelling case to the national leadership of this country that we need to provide additional resources to schools. And so a lot of the conversations in Washington have really focused on whether, additional emergency relief is needed for states and school districts around the country to try to help weather, this tragedy, really. I wish I could say that I think that additional stimulus money is going to get across the finish line. I think it's getting bogged down in, sort of that last 6 weeks of election year politics. There is a bill out there that has been under negotiations for at least the past month, maybe even a little longer, focused on, it would basically provide about a little over $100 billion in education relief for K-12 schools. But there's been a lot of conversations about, trying to maybe attach something onto that bill related to school choice provisions, which is a priority of the president, and that has come up against some significant pushback from some of the members in the Democratic Party. So I'm a little concerned that it's not going to get across the finish line at this point until we get past the election and we are in new Congress. But that is going to be top of mind for sure. Coming into January and February. I think the first 100 days of whether it's the second term Trump administration or whether we have a new Biden administration, they're going to be consumed with stimulus. And then they're going to have to figure out the next big issue will be what to do with the spring federally required assessment schedule, and whether it will be even possible to administer those. And if not, what kind of leadership can they provide to ensure that we still have forward momentum in our efforts to build better assessment systems in this country.
Marie, anything you'd add to that?
I think Lillian did a great job of covering some of the challenges in Congress. Just zooming out a little bit more big picture, I would say that, we hear the term unprecedented times probably more than we'd care to these days, but the same goes for our education policy situation, whether that's in Congress or in state houses. Interestingly enough, the current federal law on K-12 education, the Every Student Succeeds Act, was due to expire this year. Now, when it expires, that doesn't mean it no longer is in effect. In fact, No Child Left Behind was in effect for double, I believe, the period of its authorization. As long as Congress continues to appropriate money to that law, it continues to be in effect. But in some ways, we're seeing a situation that was analogous to what happened, Lexi, when you were working on waivers at the U.S. Department of Education in, what was that, 2011, in that we have a law that's expiring. We have waivers that have been issued by the U.S. Department of Education, not because there's been a mass pressure to reauthorize the law this time, but because of this very unexpected global pandemic, which made it impossible for states to fulfill their normally mandated accountability and assessment responsibilities. And it's very much up in the air. And I think just looking big picture, many have said that this is an opportunity that for us to really rethink education. But I think and that's true, because I don't think we're going to go back to 100% where we were before with what schooling looks like. I think parents and educators are starting to see in quite painful relief some of the challenges of education that have always been there, but that this pandemic is making much clearer. Things like grading policies. Now, this has nothing to do with federal policy. Federal policy does not get involved in grading. But I think it goes back to things like, how do schools use time? How do teachers teach? And what does that mean for funding, which does have a ripple effect for federal policy. So things like seat time, requiring students to be in front of a camera for a certain amount of time. I think everyone's realizing that doesn't equal learning. And it didn't equal learning when they were sitting in a classroom either, but now parents are seeing that face to face. And teachers have not been prepared for this moment. They have not been prepared for preparing students for more of a standards-based or mastery-based approach to learning that the asynchronous modality requires. So I think that sort of we're going to continue to see a lot of upward pressure from the ground up from folks like those that are listening in to this webinar, questioning why we would want to go back to the way we've done it before, yet at the same time acknowledging the ways that we are vastly underprepared for digital learning.
I would say, as a parent, that all really resonates with me navigating virtual learning right now for my kids. It has been interesting to see how it used to be, as a parent, you kind of send them and you get your check-ins when you can, and now it's like it's always just like it's right there across the table from you, and seeing the teachers really doing heroic work, but not having kind of what they need to meet the moment in all cases is very, very true and rings home for me. So we talked a little bit, you both touched a little bit in talking about what Congress is up to now on what some of these key areas that Congress and education policy at the federal level is engaged in. And one of the things that we want to make sure we're helping educators on the ground to understand is what is the responsibility at different levels of policy. So when we think about the federal government, you both talked a little bit about assessments and accountability. Can you expand a little bit on what are some of the key federal roles? So as an educator, if I see a problem, what are some of those problems I might be seeing that the federal government would be the place that I would want to go to talk about those problems to? Maria, do you want to get started on that one?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important for everyone to understand that the U.S. Department of Education is not allowed to, there's a very, very extensive list of things that the U.S. Department of Education, Secretary of Education are not allowed to tell states and districts what to do. Those include things like I just mentioned, grading. They include things like personnel matters. They include standards, academic standards. They include the tests that are administered. And I think sometimes this fact comes as a surprise to many people because we often see issues like testing and accountability tossed around when we talk about federal accountability and federal education policy. But what the federal role is to require states to do certain things in order to get funding. And while the department can't dictate what the standards are or what the tests are, they can set standards for standards, standards for assessments, standards of quality and rigor. And then it's up to the states to write those and determine what those actually look like. And so that's why that the additional flexibility to an already frankly flexible system creates a moment where folks that have different thoughts on what the state role in accountability and assessment, this is time to speak up. Because and the federal staffers need to hear this. They need to hear that there are things out there that are working. This is what's going on in my school. This is promising. You can trust districts. You can trust states to innovate. And so that, I think, is a message that is important to bring to the federal government, that rather than reining in even more on what those standards are for academic standards and assessments, it's still a good time to encourage that flexibility.
Great. Lillian, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I think just a couple of points. Maria's point about the federal role really being to distribute resources in exchange for certain conditions or requirements that they place on that, I think is really well described. I mean, we have to remember that the federal government only provides about it may be a little less than 10% now of funding for education, right? The majority of funding for K-12 education is coming from states. But the federal government is really savvy in how they use sort of strings or conditions by which to target that funding and to basically demand certain behaviors from states in exchange for that. And so where we see so much of that coming into play, right, is around putting the appropriate systems in place at the state level to make sure that you are evaluating the quality of your education system, that you can appropriately identify where students are struggling in schools and schools maybe aren't performing at a level that they need to meet the needs of those students, and what practices we need to put in place to make sure that we're targeting resources and strategies to the students who need the most. And I think, when you're in your classroom as an educator and you're thinking about federal decisions that impact you, they're going to be things like, the the administering of assessments at the end of the year in English language arts, math, science. All the other subjects that are tested, that's a state policy. And states have had a lot of really interesting dialogue over the past really 5 years, trying to figure out which subjects they need to test in, which they don't, trying to right size the amount of assessments that are being administered in their schools. When you are looking at the dashboards or the accountability systems that are built to evaluate the overall quality of your school, some of those indicators are going to be federally required, and some may be indicators that the state has added on in addition, could even be indicators that your local school might have added on in addition. And so it's really trying to get clarity on which ones are federally required. Those would be things like, percent proficient on your state tests, graduation rates, percentage of English language learners that are achieving proficiency in the language, and I think we are seeing an explosion of new indicators from states to add on and from districts to add on, which is great. We're getting lots more data, but it's really important that as education advocates that you lift your voice up about what indicators are going to paint the best picture of performance in your particular school district. And then I could think just the last thing I'll say is, the federal government, with that 8% of funding, 10% of funding, they do target those resources strategically, and you guys will be the ones to best advocate for the practices that are working with those dollars. And so how do you lift that information back up to your policymakers so that they can ensure that those formula programs, those block grant programs are structured in a way that those resources are being spent and dedicated to effective practice? I mean, we have that conversation at the federal level all the time. We kind of, there's this impression that a check is cut and it goes out the door, and oftentimes we have no idea how it's spent or if it's being used wisely. And for you to lift your voice to help shape and ensure that those resources are spent wisely, I think that's a really important advocacy position as well.
Thanks. I think those are great points on both the kind of assessment and accountability end and on the funding end, because those are some of the main ways the federal government engages. I definitely think that in a emergency potential stimulus type situation like we're in now, it does the funding part of that, even though it's overall very low what the federal government does. I think there's the promise that maybe that could be more. There was some more in the CARES Act in the spring, but I know educators and groups representing them are lobbying hard to Congress to get significantly more funds, like you both were talking about earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, Lexi,
So
and if I could just add something, because I know we're really focusing on K-12 policy, but I do think we would be remiss if we didn't make a little nod to what's going on in early childhood education, special education, as well as higher education, because I think right now actually where we're seeing a lot of the energy, because one of our biggest weak spots is around childcare and early education, and this is a real crisis time for that sector from a both a supply and a demand point of view. And special education, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, is what sets the requirements that schools must follow for accommodating the needs of students with disabilities. So, and that's the current pandemic with distance and hybrid learning is also exposing some weak spots in the ability to provide those accommodations. So those are, our focus is K-12, but there's always these intersecting issues, whether it's with early child care and education, whether it's with the student supports that they get throughout their education, or moving on to higher ed and how that's funded.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you bringing those up because there are a lot of those intersection points that I know a lot of educators are always thinking about. And Virginia has been looking to make some expansions of pre-K and early childhood, and I think the funding challenges of that are something that's really real for a lot of folks in the Commonwealth right now. So I want you both to put on your former staffer hats, right? So you both once worked for members of Congress on the Hill, and so you were on the other side of the table, right, of the advocates and the educators who would come in. What is some advice that you would give based on your experience of what kind of successful advocacy look like, particularly from a practitioner? So not a think tank person and not a researcher, but someone who spends their day job actually working with schools and with kids on the ground. What would be the advice that you would give them for thinking about how to approach that meeting? And I'll call Lillian first this time.
Yeah, so my perspective of the role of policymakers, whether it's at the federal or the state or the local level, really is, the job of a policymaker is really to make sure that there are no barriers in the way that would ensure successful, high impact practices on the ground. And so I would say it would be really helpful to think about, is there something that is in the way currently that's making it really difficult for you to do your job that is the result of a federal policy? And I would begin to think about, as a result of that, what are sort of all of the impacts of that potential policy barrier? What are some of the unintended consequences? What are, some of the opportunity costs associated with that? And I would really help paint a picture of the problem and then maybe what the solution might be. If that barrier were removed, what could you achieve locally if that wasn't there? I would also, to the extent possible, and I know this is forever a challenge in the education industry, but try to come prepared with really concrete examples and data. And again, that's true across the board. I mean, I remember, when I was serving on the PTA for my kid's school district last year, and we were trying to prove that there was a busing shortage, and we had one school bus that didn't pick up kids until an hour later because they were running a different route, and I couldn't effectively advocate until I had time-stamped data on what time each kid was getting picked up, right? Like, I had to have the data to bring back to be able to articulate to the district why that needed to change. And I think that's very true at every level of the system. So for any policymaker, particularly a federal policymaker, they want to be able to sing the praises of a great program or initiative in their state or in their congressional district, and to have compelling data for that, I think is going to be, your best way forward.
Yeah, I think that is, that last point is really important, because just sharing what you yourself are doing in your community is really important and powerful information. And I wouldn't assume that your Congress people have access to that information or that they know it by default. Typically, they are very busy. They're relying on some trusted friends who may be with advocacy organizations, or maybe there's one superintendent in their home state that they just have a good rapport with and they tend to pick up the phone. One thing I learned when I left the Hill was how limited my view of what reality actually was. And it pains me to say that, but it's true. There's a whole industry devoted to influencing Congress. And yet your voice as an individual educator and education leader is so important and valuable. As a staffer, I always had this sort of filter in my mind. One of the questions I was always asking as I was listening was one that Lillian mentioned. Is this actually a federal problem? Or is the issue that they're talking about something that needs to be addressed at the state or local level? And if they were coming to me and asking me to help change a policy that the federal government didn't have any jurisdiction over, I would try to pivot the meeting if I had the time, just to learn about what they were doing. Which brings me to the second piece, which is I had often many different changing filters in my head of things I was trying to learn. There might have been 10 different questions we were currently wrestling with in a negotiation. Is it possible to do a program this way? If we do require A, B, and C, will it make it possible to do D? One example of an issue that Lillian and I have worked on as advocates in the field is around innovative assessment. And just being able to shed some light on the stories of what's happening at the local level to show that this isn't just like a fly-by-night operation. This isn't a dummying down of standards or learning, that quite the opposite. We could show evidence of the rigor and the student agency that was happening with these innovative systems of assessments, just to educate staffers that this is possible. And maybe you give them something they can use right now. Maybe they're planning a hearing and they're looking for an example of a district that does X, Y, and Z, and hey, you are their unicorn. But maybe they are also, you're just planting a seed for the future, so that a year from now, when an idea that they had been resistant to suddenly comes up as something that a lot of constituents want them to work on, they think of you. So I think education for any educator, anyone working within the education system, educating your policymakers about what you're doing that's working and what barriers you're facing that aren't working, I think are some of the most important things you can do when interacting with Congress.
I love all those points that you both made, and to underscore, you should not assume necessarily a high level of knowledge and understanding from every staffer that you're going to interact with. And so thinking about how to explain kind of what you're up to and what's going on that you see working is a really great starting point that you should not assume, because most staffers are also coming to the conversation with their personal background as well as kind of who they have happened to kind of bring in as their own advisors. And sometimes that might match your experience in your educational leadership, but sometimes it might not. And so to not go in with that assumption. And then the part about being able to tell a good story that is backed by data and is backed by specifics is also incredibly important. Members of Congress love to talk about stories from their home state or their home district. I felt like I was constantly on the search for the next like really great example of something happening. I worked for a senator from Illinois, of something happening somewhere in Illinois. So that was the sort of thing that would perk my ears up, right? It was either something we're wrestling with right now, or, oh, that's a really great story. And I could weave that into, say, explaining why schools need more money in a global pandemic, right? A really concrete example of what the impact of that is having on the ground would be something that I could take with me and pass on to my boss to make use of. So those are great points. And I do think just like, don't be intimidated. I feel like sometimes engaging in policy or talking to policymakers, because they can speak a different language that you don't understand, right? Like there's a bubble here in Washington, D.C., and it can feel impenetrable, but not to be intimidated by the conversation, to really come into it with your own strength and knowledge and what you're bringing to it. And also don't be surprised if you meet with a staffer and they're 23, because that is also very, very real. Congress tends to be run by a bunch of 23, 24-year-olds.
And that you might end up meeting in the hallway or in a closet. You never know. very limited, but that meeting may be just as important as one sitting in a congressional or Senate office.
And
Absolutely.
and they are, for the most part, brilliant
Mm-hmm.
20-year-olds who have a lot of passion, especially in education, who have a lot of passion for change. But they're also being called to know a lot about a lot of different things. And sometimes the insecurity they may feel around that manifests in ways that might make you feel intimidated. Just know that. You are an expert in what you're doing. You know more than anyone else about what you yourself are doing in your district, in your school, in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's very important to remember. So we talked a little bit about kind of in mind of like going and doing a meeting in Washington, D.C. And I think some folks listening to this might have that opportunity. I hope that they do. If they don't, are there other ways that they should think about engaging with federal policymakers? Perhaps if they can't make the trip to DC, especially right now in the midst of a crazy school year and a pandemic and everything else.
Yeah, the pandemic's really putting a damper on things. We all have to get innovative and think of different ways to do things. How I used to answer this question pre-pandemic was encouraging, was reminding everybody that both senators and representatives have district offices too, right? And they spend the majority of their time actually in their district, and that's where their job is, to connect with those locally. And so, you want to do everything you can to try to make that connection in state, in district. You want to invite them out to your schools, to, events. You want to just do everything you can to cultivate that relationship. Recognizing we are now in a situation where that makes all of that very difficult, if not impossible, to do safely. I think it's important that we really think about all of the ways to advocate. It's everything from, sending an email letter to picking up the phone and calling, a congressional office, to asking for a virtual meeting, and using that as an opportunity to bring more voices and perspectives into that meeting and conversation than you otherwise could if you had to pay plane tickets, to get to Washington, D.C. It's making sure that, you make the time, if you find out that they're holding a virtual town hall meeting, to be one of the participants on there, putting your questions in the chat and chiming up and asking, a question when you're asked. It may even be, writing a letter to the editor just to get the ideas and issues, out into the public sphere. I think it's so important too to remember the power of social media in this world that we're in, and that, you have the ability to articulate a message and tag a member of Congress's social media account, and, add your voice and make sure your followers are also seeing that this issue is important and that they can also add their voice. There's so many different ways we have now that, it shouldn't be hard to find the space and time to be able to advocate. So I encourage people to get creative, to put the pressure on, to make sure that you find the right medium, for the message you want to deliver, and to just make sure your voice is heard.
Yeah, I mean, that's all such great advice. Typically, under normal circumstances, I would say invite them for a visit when they're back in the district. There's nothing more powerful than just seeing it in action. You can talk about it all day, but if they come and they see it for 15 minutes, they're going to learn more about it that way than anything. So yeah, how do we do that now? I think in addition to taking individual actions, which are incredibly powerful because they come from your own perspective. And again, no one is more of an expert than you in what you're doing. There's also a lot of organizations out there that are doing a lot of heavy lifting. And, find an organization whose policy agenda aligns with your values. Maybe it's a professional association, maybe it's a think tank like the one that Lillian works at, you know, it's, or JFF. But I think that just being able to do your job as an educator or district leader and also be an advocate is a lot. So there's a lot of organizations out there that provide training like what we're doing right now, but that also let you know when you have a particularly important opportunity in terms of the timing to call your Congress members. So those are good networks to be a part of as well, in addition to taking the individual actions.
I love the points about organizing and tapping into broader networks and about creativity. We were going to do this as a conference over the summer, and now it's a podcast series. So, you know, we're all making adjustments. And I think the federal policymakers are maybe, they're always like a little bit behind. So they might be a little bit slower to that than others. But at JFF, we've been engaging with congressional staff via Zoom meetings and via phone calls. And I think there is in some ways a benefit for some of them that they're actually not quite as busy as they might have been before when they were having meetings coming in their door all day long. Now they're also often working from home, and it might be a good time to try and make some of those connections that won't have been possible before. And think about, maybe it's not one-on-one, but maybe it's getting together, doing some organizing, right? Getting together a group of other educators or other leaders from your district and thinking about how you might create some kind of really engaging content in the same way that you're doing for your students right now, virtually often, right? We had one of the superintendents that we worked with a few years ago had some state legislators from Virginia come and did this was in person, but he had them all do a performance assessment that one of the schools was developing, just to show, because it was that old world, tests need to look like this, new world, oh, actually, wow, this is hard, this is like in depth, this is interesting. And the impact and the ripples of just that interaction that they had set up for those legislators, we were still hearing from years later as in terms of the impact of that. So it's a great time to get creative. It's a great time to think about what other ways of engaging might look like, and telling your story and helping policymakers really understand and experience it for themselves.
Yeah, maybe invite them to like a team meeting in your district of content area leads, or, you know, it doesn't even have to be with the students. It can be with you talking about what, you know, your lesson planning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I feel like we could get like a cool like brainstorm going of like the ways that you might do this. It would benefit us too. Okay, so last question. We talked a little bit about this, about kind of individuals who have never done this before, right? Who have never engaged in policy in any other way, who clearly didn't have like the bug that the three of us had early in our careers, but who for whatever reason are like, feel called in this moment to engage in a different way based on what they're seeing around them and want to do more. Is there any additional advice that you haven't already talked about that you would want to express to that individual who is maybe taking kind of their first steps into the advocacy space and really looking for support in doing so? Maria, do you want to start this time?
So I know that we're talking about federal advocacy, but I think right now the most impactful place you can be an advocate is in your community. I myself have gotten involved in some local organizations, and it's just a more immediate impact that you can have. You have direct access to the policymakers. You can show up at the committee meetings and testify. And as a local constituent, you again are an expert on what's happening. So I think the federal advocacy is important. You know, subscribe to an organization's newsletter that keeps you apprised and when you can write to your Congress people. But right now, seek out those opportunities in your communities. Maybe it's your local NAACP. or your school board, or your city council or county council. Show up to some of those meetings, see what the issues that they are wrestling with. And as a member of that community, your word carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add on the federal front, going back to that image of that, 23 or 28-year-old staffer, knowing that their schedule likely looks like, 10, 15, 30-minute meetings a day, and, they're working long hours at night. You are the expert on what you're coming in, and to the extent that you follow up and continue to provide information as the expert on that particular issue, you will form a relationship with that staffer. And that busy staffer will continue to go back to you because they don't have time to seek out a new perspective every time, they want to learn more about this issue. And so, I know when I was working on education issues, without fail, I would end up, with, maybe 4, 5, 6, really trusted voices from the field that would kind of become in my inner circle. They were the people that at the end of the day, I wanted to, run draft legislation by. They might be the people that I would think of first when I was looking for witnesses to participate in a congressional hearing, or to help me find witnesses within their networks. And, it's all because I felt like I had an incredible relationship and I trusted those people to follow through and to be there when I needed them with the information that I needed. So, don't think of advocacy as kind of a one and done experience. Think about it as a goal of, the first meeting is developing a relationship, and then it's your job to take that extra step to really cultivate and deepen that relationship and become that trusted advisor over time.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. And I think another way that you can become part of that trusted relationship is by getting involved with a professional association, because or a think tank, or whatever organizations sort of resonate with you, because oftentimes that person, that director of policy, they're the broker of the information, but they still have to go out and find the witnesses. They have to find the experts. They have to find the examples. I spent a lot of time when I was vice president for policy at the Aurora Institute, just really combing through blogs, meeting with people, just always trying to find new examples of districts that were doing competency-based education well, because we got so many requests from the Hill and from other organizations about what those examples were. So so build that relationship directly, or again, if you don't have the time to do that, getting involved in associations and advocacy organizations can also be a way for you to spotlight what you're working on.
Awesome. I love those ideas. I feel engaged and empowered now and ready to go.
Love it. There's certainly a lot to weigh in on right now, so we'll put you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Lillian, for joining us today. I hope that everybody who was able to watch or to listen to this learned something new. I believe you can find all of us on Twitter and at our various organization websites. And please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything further that you want to discuss. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.